Did Marcus Aurelius fight some Germans? Yeah, he did. But when you know anything about Roman history, this entire movie just makes no sense. Why would a Roman emperor go to a general and say, well, I want Rome to become a republic again? I don't know of any Roman emperors that decided that they wanted Rome to become a republic again. I think at that point they were like, well, we're in the imperial system. The emperor is at the top of this system, and that's just the way that it is. Hello guys, I'm Zahir, and today I'm going to be talking about the original Gladiator movie that came out in the year 2000. Gladiator 2 is just around the corner. It's coming out here in the UK this week. I'm going to be giving a quick rundown of the story, just a few little facts about how the movie was made, and of course the historical accuracy of the film as well. Let's get into it. Just a heads up, guys, spoilers throughout for the movie Gladiator. Now, the first thing to note about this movie is that it kind of opens with a bit of text. It assumes that you don't really know anything about the Romans. And of course, I didn't know anything about the Romans when I first saw it back in, I think, the year 2001, probably. And I hadn't seen it actually since then. So in watching it again recently, I saw the extended cut, which gives you, I think, another 15 or 20 minutes or thereabouts of the movie. But it opens, of course, with Hans Zimmer, fantastic soundtrack, and just a bit of text about, Marcus Aurelius being in the north and fighting the Germanians, the Germans, and trying to sort of expand or stabilize the empire. And that opening scene is quite iconic. There are other candidates like Ben-Hur and Spartacus, and maybe there's others that I'm not aware of. I would say that Gladiator is not just a Roman movie; it's the Roman movie. If you want to recommend a movie about Rome to somebody, then that's the one that you really want to go with. And that opening scene, that opening battle is fantastic in just a hell of a lot of ways. If there was CGI in that scene, I didn't notice it. As far as I could tell, they got all of those extras. Apparently they actually burnt down the forest as well, and it's got some really iconic lines. What we do in life echoes for eternity. And the interesting thing about this movie was that it was apparently shot without a script. I mean, they were still sort of making it up as they went along, because they hadn't finalized a lot of the stuff for the movie, while it was being made. A lot of movies and other projects that end up getting stuck in development hell, and it's kind of chaos for everyone that's involved in making the movie, and, it either turns out like a piece of shit or ends up like something like Gladiator, where everything comes together and it works as a film. But there were some incredible shots. I think about the flaming arrows, the catapults, flaming catapults firing what look like large pots of oil. The Germans coming out of the forest, and right before that, Maximus says something like they disagree or something. Essentially, negotiations have failed. There's that line from Avatar, the movie. The guy who's doing the negotiations on the Roman side comes riding back without a head on top of a horse right before the Germans come out of the forest and essentially say, "Fuck you, we're Germans. The Romans can go to hell. We're not putting up with your shit." And if you know anything about the history of the Germans, the Germanians, and the Romans, they gave the Romans a hell of a lot of trouble. A hell of a lot of trouble. If you know anything about the Battle of Teutoburg Forest under Augustus, they destroyed an entire legion, and that was pretty much the extent of the Roman Empire going north. They kept showing on the subtitles. I had the subtitles on Roma Victor. Roma Victor. It's not Roma Victor, it's Roma Invicta, meaning Rome unconquered or Rome invincible Rome. The first YouTube video I ever wanted to make actually was on this movie, and was on a certain character called Marcus Aurelius, who is the emperor in this film, fantastically played by Richard Harris. It's interesting because everyone seems to remember Richard Harris as Dumbledore, but for me, really, he's Marcus Aurelius. When Commodus arrives, he arrives after the battle. And Commodus asks his dad when he arrives, he says, "Have I missed the battle, father?" And Marcus Aurelius says, "You have missed the war." If only that was the end of the war. But there's some great lines in this. There's always somebody left to fight. There's a fantastic scene between Maximus and Marcus Aurelius. It's really, really great. Marcus Aurelius is talking about, as a man who's now coming towards the end of his life, well, how will he be remembered? Will he be remembered as the dictator, as the philosopher? And if you know your history, then Marcus Aurelius is one of the things he's referred to is as the philosopher, because he was a philosopher. And that's one of the things that this movie gets correct, is that he was a guy that was big into philosophy. And there may very well be people that disagree with me here. What little I know about him, the sense I get about him, the real Marcus Aurelius, is that he didn't really want the job. There's a story that when he first found out that he was next in line for succession, he was quite upset about it when he had to leave his mother's home to then go live, I think with the then emperor, and had to essentially be trained up for the job. He was a teenager and he was very into philosophy, and what he really wanted more than anything else was to study philosophy. And he was quite unhappy, I think, about suddenly finding out that he's now next in line. There's a story actually also that when the time finally came and they were about to give him his imperial power, that he had something called horror imperii, terror of imperial power. This is a man who is being offered the top job in the Roman Empire, and his first instinct is, I don't want it. I don't want it. It's not for me. Had he been given the choice, I think he would have spent the rest of his life as a philosopher. And of course, once again, if you know your history, then Marcus Aurelius was well known as a Stoic philosopher, as one of the great Stoic philosophers. There's a reason that they called him the philosopher. And he's one of the archetypes, one of the others being Alexander the Great, or Alexander of Macedonia. He's one of the archetypes of the philosopher king. This archetype, this idea of this kind of person that, the kind of person that you really want in power at the top of any sort of empire running a nation, is the kind of person who sits around thinking about thinking, who spends a lot of time philosophizing and thinking about morality and what the correct thing is to do, and all of those kinds of things. And the reason why this is important, at least to me, is because this scene with Marcus Aurelius and Maximus, the dialogue's just absolutely fantastic. It's brilliant. Marcus Aurelius sort of thinking about the life that he's lived. He says, I'm dying. How will I be remembered? He's now thinking about these things. He asks Maximus, when was the last time you saw your family? And he says, 2 years, 264 days, and this morning. Fantastic characterization, fantastic dialogue, just shows you exactly what you need to know about these two men. And the thing that stood out for me more than anything else is when Marcus Aurelius is saying, Rome has become corrupted, and look what it has become. You have not been there, you have not seen it. And he wants Rome to become a republic again. The movie is set in the imperial period, in the empire period. Rome was once a republic where lots of power was with the Senate. But of course, once the emperors took over, the emperors are the ones who have the most power. The Senate, and quite a lot of the time, are rubber stamping stuff. They don't have too much power. The thing that got me for this scene, at least, is that when Marcus Aurelius says to Maximus, I want you to make Rome a republic again. I want you to take the responsibility of running the empire once I die, and then working with the Senate to make Rome a republic, to make it great, to deal with the corruption, and to really live up to the promise of what Rome is meant to be. Maximus says that Rome is the light. Much of the world is dark and brutish. And what is Maximus's reply? When Marcus Aurelius says, will you accept this great honor from me? Maximus says, he pauses and he says, with all my heart, no. I cannot accept it. And I thought that was very interesting, the kind of the the similarities between Marcus Aurelius, the real Marcus Aurelius, who, when given that opportunity, had that horror imperia, like, no, 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 I don't want this imperial power, I don't want it. And even, teenage me at the time that saw Gladiator back then figured out enough that from that scene that the person you should give power is the person that does not want it. And in this case, Maximus is being offered the top job, head honcho. Essentially, he would be emperor. And he says, I don't want it. And of course, that speaks to the character of Maximus. He's not interested in power. What does he want? He wants to go home, back to Spain, and he wants to live with his wife and children on the farm. If you want to know about the history of this movie and you know nothing about Roman history, I'm just going to mention it here. Like 90% of this film is not historically accurate. It didn't happen. Let's just get this out of the way. Maximus is not a real person. He did not exist. He's made up for the purposes of this movie. Essentially, the only part of this movie that's really historically accurate is that, there was an emperor called Marcus Aurelius, and there was an emperor called Commodus, who was Marcus Aurelius's son, and I think I've got now Marcus Aurelius's daughter and her son. These were real people, but pretty much the entirety of the movie did not happen. Did Marcus Aurelius fight some Germans? Yeah, he did. But when you know anything about Roman history, this entire movie just makes no sense. Why would a Roman emperor go to a general and say, I want Rome to become a republic again? I don't know of any Roman emperors that decided that they wanted Rome to become a republic again. I think at that point they were like, we're in the imperial system. The emperor is at the top of this system, and that's just the way that it is. One of the things that the movie also mentions are the 4 Stoic virtues, temperance, justice, courage, and wisdom. And those virtues are essentially meant to tell you how to live a good life. If you're interested in sort of Marcus Aurelius's philosophy, you could read something like Meditations, which was his essentially his thoughts that he wrote down to himself. They were discovered after his death. I don't think they were meant to be published. I think there's some questions over whether or not he actually wrote that, but my understanding is that the academic consensus, I think, is that he probably did write it. It's very interesting to hear the innermost thoughts of a Roman emperor. Go check out Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I was shocked when I listened to, I think, the first sort of chapter of it, of my own arrogance listening to this thing, because a lot of it is sort of about how you should appreciate the kind of small things in your life, the small pleasures, and how to deal with things like suffering. That's much of what the of what Meditations is about. 4 Stoic virtues are mentioned by Commodus in his conversation with his dad. He goes to speak to his dad. Essentially, he says, here are the four virtues, that you uphold, and perhaps I do not have them, but I have other virtues. I have ambition and other things, and determination. This movie was my introduction not only to Rome in movies, but it was also my introduction, and I'm guessing their introduction for a lot of people, to Joaquin Phoenix, who of course is an established actor, but he's an interesting chap because he's one of those. He was a musician like his brother River, and it's very interesting. Certain musicians, Jared Leto is one of them. There are some others who seem to just be able to kind of act. There's something about being a kind of an artistic type person that allows you to, I guess, make music and also be quite good at acting too. So having had this conversation with Marcus, his father, Commodus is quite upset. And again, Joaquin Phoenix and both Richard Harris, actually, their acting chops are just like full on, like fantastically well acted scene. Really, really, really great. Joaquin Phoenix has this great way of portraying Commodus as this kind of whiny man-child, basically. That's essentially what he is. He's a bit of a whiny man-child, he's like crying, but he's also Quite dangerous, quite psychopathic. And Marcus Aurelius tells Commodus, you will not be emperor. Of course, Commodus, being Marcus Aurelius' son, is expecting to be emperor. And fantastically well done, where they show that Commodus ends up killing his father. If you get sort of a bad feeling in your chest while you're watching a certain scene in a movie, then like you've done a fantastic job. Just the way Joaquin Phoenix is holding Richard Harris's head and squeezing it, and you can hear just the expression on his face and the way he's like a man having a tantrum while he's killing his father. Like, brilliantly well done. So of course Commodus ends up killing his dad, and the next scene is quite important. So I would say this is the end of the first act. What is about to happen next? Maximus is summoned from his bed. He's woken up in the middle of the night, and then he meets with Commodus, and Commodus says, and I remember this even from like 20 odd years ago, "Lament with me, brother, our great father is dead." And there's this sense that, because Maximus was the son that Marcus Aurelius never had, he was the father, in a sense, to both of them. And there was that great line in the previous scene, where the emperor says to his son, "Your failures as a man are my failures as a father." And fantastically delivered line. Commodus now says to Maximus, and Russell Crowe looks a little bit like there's something wrong here, says to Maximus, "Will you take my hand, brother? In my time of need, will you take my hand? I offer it only once. I offer it only once." And this is really kind of the beginning of the movie, by the way, because this is where shit kicks off. Up to this point, I mean, we've seen a war and the dad's been killed and all the rest of it, but this is where things really kick off. My understanding of storytelling is that a act ends when the protagonist makes a decision that they can't turn back from. What does Maximus do when Commodus offers his hand? He turns away and he walks away. That was his decision. And that's his decision that he can't walk away from, because true to his word, when Commodus says, "I offer it only once," he means it. He means it. Maximus then goes back and speaks to his slave Cicero, his servant, and says, the emperor has been slain, and starts preparing to put on his armor and all the rest of it. And of course, this is where shit kicks off. Before Maximus can get his sword, he's picked up by a bunch of Praetorians. Praetorians, if you don't know, were essentially the kind of, you could think of them as the special forces of the Roman Empire. I believe they were created by Augustus, the first emperor, and he essentially created them because he wanted his own troops in the city. Like, under the Republic, you weren't allowed to keep Roman troops in Italy. Generals had to keep their troops outside of the borders of Italy. This is where the saying, to cross the Rubicon comes from. Julius Caesar had a choice. The Senate was sort of after him, and they were going to try him for a bunch of different stuff. And so he decided to cross the Rubicon with his legions, which was illegal, which essentially made him an outlaw in Rome. And hence that's why he said, the die is cast. He's rolling the dice. He's making a gamble. To cross the Rubicon means to make a decision that you cannot turn back from. So Maximus is then picked up by the Praetorians and he's taken away. They're gonna kill him. And of course Maximus finds a way out of this, because he's the protagonist. This is not Game of Thrones. And he finds a way out, and he sustains a wound, I think, to his upper arm, and then he escapes with 2 horses, because he's told, and again, once again, great storytelling, because he asks about his wife and children. He says, "What will happen to my wife and children?" And he's told by the Praetorian, "You will meet them in the afterlife." So, his his goals are, you know what his motivations are, you know why he's fighting, why he's trying to stay alive. Well, he's riding towards, I guess he's trying to get back to Spain. He's trying to get back to Spain to try and save his wife and children. Hey guys, if you're liking this kind of content, if you like this video, please do like, subscribe, leave a comment, let me know what you think. What do you think of Gladiator? Does it still hold up today? Do you think it needed a sequel? What were your first thoughts when you heard about them making a sequel? Do you think that it might potentially ruin the legacy of this movie, which I think has held up to this point? Drop a comment, let me know what you think. Maximus begins fighting as a gladiator, in Morocco. I can't remember where it was set in the actual movie itself, but it's really great, the storytelling where they show sort of they're painting the slaves either red, I think, or yellow, depending on whether or not they can fight. And Maximus, of course, refuses to fight, but manages to get through to the next round. Oliver Reed's character Proximo is essentially, he doesn't give a shit about who you are and who you were in another life. It doesn't really matter. Your goal at this point, or the road you're taking, is going to end up in your death. And there's a line from Proximo. I think I don't know if it's before or after the first fight. He says, ultimately we're all dead men. Sadly, we cannot choose how, but we can decide how we meet that end, in order that we are remembered as men. This is that kind of first fight with Maximus and Juba and the big German guy whose name I don't know, but this is where Maximus, I think, hurls a spear at the people up at the top and says, are you not entertained? Again, one of those iconic lines from the movie, and I think something that was taken from Spartacus, which was probably the other, one of the other three big Roman movies, Spartacus and Fall of the Roman Empire and Ben-Hur. But one thing about Fall of the Roman Empire, so this is, I think, a movie from the 70s, and I can't remember how, but I started watching it. I think somebody I knew had it on DVD, and I just put it on as a teenager, and I was watching it, and I was like, oh, this is an old movie, it doesn't look very good, and I'm thinking about Gladiator. But I'm watching this story, and the story is of Marcus Aurelius and of his son Commodus. And I think Commodus speaks to some politicians, and one maybe convinces him to kill his dad, and he ends up killing his dad using poison, as opposed to smothering him in Gladiator. And I just remember thinking, I was like, is this the plot of the movie Gladiator? Because of course Commodus then becomes next in line. And so something to know about Gladiator is that part of the story was based on this movie, The Fall of the Roman Empire, which I'm guessing quite a lot of that is also not historical too. Surviving that first battle and Maximus killing a bunch of dudes, basically, he shows that he's capable of fighting, but Proximo kind of tries to teach him and says, well, you need to win the crowd. You don't just want to kill people, you need to win the crowd. There's this story, of course, back in Rome, of the way that Commodus is now intending to put on 128 days of games, and of course emperors would do this. They would put on a certain amount of games to kind of keep the people happy, to stop them from revolting. And though Commodus does it in response to a potential plague outbreak, crazy. But there's just one thing about this movie, the one that I saw, because I saw the extended cut of Gladiator, and in the extended cut they include more of the politics, which they mostly cut out actually in the theatrical cut. But the addition of the political stuff, I think, is not bad. I think it kind of works, gives you a bit of backstory, especially if you've seen the movie already. And there's a conversation between Gracchus and I think Falco, perhaps the other senator who's working with Commodus, or is loyal to Commodus. And Gracchus is essentially saying, he's gonna give the people what they want. He's going to give them blood and games, and they'll love him for it. And he'll take their freedom away, whatever freedom they might have in Rome at this point, but he'll keep them happy. This also gives Maximus his motivation now. Well, why would he want to fight and survive in these gladiatorial games, and wherever he is right now. Well, if he does well, he could be sent to Rome because Commodus is now running these games. Proximo asks Maximus what he wants, and Maximus says, I want to be brought before the emperor himself. So of course, again, fantastic storytelling. His motivations. Why is he trying to fight? What is he trying to do? Well, he wants to get in front of the man who killed his children and his wife and destroyed his life. Apparently the original inspiration for Gladiator was the book by Daniel P. Mannix, Those About to Die. You might have heard of that. Amazon made a TV show about it, which I didn't see, with Anthony Hopkins and a few other actors. And I have to say, there's not too much of that book in this movie, like next to nothing. The only things that I could pick out were the different classes of gladiator that I mentioned in the book. For instance, I think in the second battle that Maximus takes part in, there's a guy with a net. You might have noticed that. There's a guy with a trident. I don't know if you picked up on that. And there's sort of a secutor, I think is the name of this other class, who has sort of some armor and a short sword or a gladius. The only thing besides that I can think of is that in the movie, at least, they show Christians that are being taken into the arena, and in some cases they're being fed to the animals. In the book, of course, it's the Jews that are being fed to the wild animals in the arena. And this was something that both, I think, Christians and Jews at different times of the empire were being fed to wild animals in the arena. So of course Maximus now has his goal to get in front of the Emperor Commodus so that he can presumably take the guy out. And as I mentioned, that the politics in the theatrical release was largely cut out, but there's a bit more that's in the extended cut. I think it's Lucilla. She goes to see, that's Marcus Aurelius' daughter, Commodus' sister, and Maximus's former flame. She goes at night to see Gracchus. She's having to do it under cover of dark, and she's mentioning that they're arresting scholars now. So Commodus is now getting rid of his political enemies. There's a point in another scene where he's asking Lucilla, a different scene, he's saying, I could dissolve the Senate now. In that same scene where Gracchus is talking to Lucilla, they're kind of asking, well, how is he managing to pay for all these games? Because if you know anything about the Roman games, they were very expensive. When Juba says earlier in the movie that the lion, they will feed you to lions, they are worth more than you. That was true. Lions, leopards, giraffes, whatever, those sorts of animals were worth more than the slaves who would end up being killed by those animals. So how is Commodus paying for all of these games? And Lucilla says that he's selling the grain reserves. He's selling the future. In 2 years' time, Rome will be starving. He's spending so much money that he's selling the grain in order to put on these games, which he at the same time he's kind of using to distract people from what he's doing while he's putting away his political enemies. There are a number of highlights in this movie, but of course one of them is really when Maximus and the other gladiators are entering the Colosseum. It looks phenomenal. It looks really well done. You can see Maximus, he's got his helmet on that obscures his face, and he's kind of looking around. They're all looking around. The camera is panning all around them, and you can see the inside of the Colosseum and the crowd, and you can hear the crowd too, and it looks absolutely incredible. I know nothing about filmmaking, but it looks amazing. Just portraying how taken in they are by this incredible thing that they're seeing. I think Juba says about the Colosseum, I did not know that men could build such things. And I have to say, for a movie that was released in 2000, I saw it on DVD. I didn't see it in 4K. I didn't see it in Ultra HD, but it looks pretty good. I remember back then, you couldn't tell it was CGI. Now, you can tell it a little bit, but like it looks pretty damn good for a movie that's 24 years old at this point. While Maximus was selecting his helmet, there's a selection of different helmets, but one of them is the Sutton Hoo helmet, which is a helmet which is in the British Museum. Quite well known as a historical artifact, but it's completely out of place there. It wouldn't really be there. It's from Northern Europe somewhere. I think is it from the UK? I think so. I think it's from the Anglo-Saxons, if I remember correctly. So you've got another battle in this, the sort of the first major battle in the Colosseum, and really great, a bit of history as well. It was the first time that I had heard the word Carthage. They mentioned that they're doing the Battle of Carthage for this one, for this performance in front of the crowd. And somebody retorts, "You mean the Massacre of Carthage?" And if you know what happened at Carthage, yeah, it's probably better to call it the Massacre of Carthage instead. Great battle scene. I'm not sure that any of the actual tactics used in the fight make any sense. I'm not really certain about that. I think they use a bit of a phalanx where they have the shield wall in front and above, but beyond that, I don't know that it kind of makes sense. I was just watching it, and the chariots that are firing arrows at the gladiators, they just start running into walls, and the chariots start flipping over, and it's not kind of clear about why they're flipping over, but they start dropping like flies. And of course, this is the first time that Maximus and of course his fellow gladiators put on a real show for the people. Fantastic shots, very iconic shots. The shot of I'm guessing it was a stunt man on a horse rather than Russell Crowe on the horse. Somebody throws a gladius at him, a Roman short sword that was used by the legionaries, and he grabs it midair, and then he's running down on his horse in the middle of the arena. Really, really great stuff. We're coming towards the end of the third act of the movie. So Commodus goes down into the arena to meet this Spaniard. He doesn't know that he's Maximus just yet, and there's that iconic line, and this of course is where Maximus speaks again, very iconic line, classic line now in movies. "I'm Maximus Decimus Meridius, commander of the armies of the north, general of the Felix legions, and loyal servant to the true emperor Marcus Aurelius, father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and I will have my vengeance in this life or the next." Really, really great line. And what makes this the end of the third act? In this case, Maximus had picked up, I think, the tip of an arrow or something, so he had a choice perhaps here to kill Commodus, but at this point he makes a choice not to. And given that Commodus now knows who he is, what are the chances that he's going to end up getting this choice again? He's going to get this chance again. Another scene that I think was in the extended cut, but I don't remember seeing in the theatrical cut last when I saw this movie, back as a teenager, was Commodus attacking his father's statue with a sword. I don't remember seeing that. So there's a little bit that was cut out that was not in the theatrical cut of the movie. One thing I should mention is, and if you know enough about Roman history, you recognize that there's the same statue of Augustus kind of with his hand out like that in multiple places throughout this film. Another scene that was missed in the theatrical cut of this film was the scene where Commodus decides to punish the men who didn't tell him that Maximus, had escaped close to the beginning of the movie. And Quintus, who is the head of the Praetorians and a character that, at least at first, Maximus seems to get on well with, but who is subsequently betrayed when he's the one who tells Maximus, by the way, you will meet your family in the next life. Quintus is given an opportunity here to kill Commodus because he commands the men that are holding onto the bows and arrows, which are meant to kill the men that did not inform Commodus of the fact that Maximus was still alive, and Commodus actually stands between the condemned men who are about to die, and of course Quintus does not do the correct thing. He doesn't do the right thing. He ends up giving the order to kill those men instead of having them kill Commodus instead. So there's more of Quintus in this film. He kind of has to go on this redemption arc in the movie. And so we have another great scene, which is where, Maximus now has to fight Tigris, and he's presented as the only man in the arena who's ever been undefeated. And of course, he's a guy who's about 7 foot tall and probably weighs about 300 pounds, 150 kilos. He's a big guy. He makes the salute before he begins to fight Tigris. He says, we who are about to die salute you. And of course, Maximus does not. His whole thing is that he's kind of defying the emperor. So in defying the emperor openly in the arena, he's creating an example for everyone else in Rome. Maximus ends up defeating Tigris. Of course, he sticks an axe through his foot, and I think throws a shield at his face, which hits Tigris's mask, and Commodus, gives the thumbs down to say that, hey, kill this guy, kill the guy, and Maximus, in not killing Tigris and making that choice, in defying Commodus, has made another choice that he cannot turn back from. He's made a choice in front of the entirety of Rome, really, that he's defying the emperor, that he's not going to do as he says. It's mentioned in one of the political scenes, the one with Lucilla and Gracchus, that was not in the theatrical cut, that they're going to have to just kind of bide their time. They're just going to have to wait. When it comes to Commodus, they can't kill him outright. They're going to have to wait for him to create more enemies, and the kind of the implication is that in seeing Maximus defying Commodus, in seeing somebody saying no to him, as he creates more enemies in Rome, this is what will allow the enemies of Commodus to bring him down. And then it's later on in the movie that Maximus ends up somehow delivering a message to his old servant Cicero, and which is delivered to Lucilla to say, Maximus will meet your politician. Maximus has made a decision. This is one of the great things about him as a character. He's actively making decisions. You know what his motivations are and what he's trying to do. And so, we're really coming to the final stretch of the movie now. It's around about this time, I can't remember if it was before or after the battle with Tigris, that Lucilla ends up meeting Maximus, and, they make it a bit more sort of explicit, of course, that they had something going on between them many, many years ago. And she's telling him, hey, Commodus has enemies, join us. There are some good men, join this guy, Gracchus, the Senator Gracchus. And Maximus is very much like, I'm a slave. I'm a dead man. I could be dead tonight. I might not make it to the morning. And Maximus had essentially said no to Lucilla. He's like, what do you want me to do? What exactly do you want me to do? One of the things that's not shown in the theatrical cut of this movie are there are a few scenes kind of dotted around towards the end of the film where there are just kind of a few men, and they're kind of, I don't know how to describe it other than they're looking a bit shady. They're kind of looking around, maybe Gracchus is having a conversation with somebody and there's a guy at a table behind him kind of looking at him, or Lucilla is walking through, I don't know if it's her house or somebody else's house, and there's a bunch of sort of dodgy looking guys like kind of laughing and, looking a bit suspicious. And, I guess this is sort of foreshadowing about what's going to happen next. Because if you watch the movie, then you know where this is going. These scenes with these dodgy guys that seem to be hanging around, obviously spies, leads into the scene that was actually in the movie. And there's a great line from Proximo in this. I know that you were a man of your word, General. I know that you would die for honor, for Rome, for the memory of your ancestors. But as for me, I am an entertainer. So Proximo up to this point has been, of course, he's a businessman, hard-nosed businessman. He negotiates very harshly. There's a scene when he's introduced with Omar Jalili, who's a comedian here in the UK, Iranian guy. But Proximo he's a practical man. He's a man who's looking to make some money and, kind of doesn't really want to get involved in any of this sort of high-minded stuff about saving Rome. And so I'm watching this film and I'm thinking, oh, Maximus must be such a great man that he has to convert the cynic Proximo. But at this point, we've got the scene with I think it's Lucius, who's going to be the protagonist in the second movie, who is, playing around with a wooden sword and, is saying, I am Maximus, the savior of Rome. And of course, this makes Commodus suspicious, and he decides to sit down and have a conversation with Lucius. And this is the point where the plot, the conspiracy against Commodus sort of begins to come apart. It was also this point in the movie that I realized, and I think I said this out loud while I was watching it with a mate of mine, that was like, Commodus is salty. He's salty because everyone loves Maximus but doesn't love Commodus. Commodus's dad, Commodus's sister, and his nephew all love Maximus, but they're not too hot on Commodus. And so, I mean, it's back to Joaquin Phoenix playing a sort of a petulant man-child prone to tantrums. Like, he does a really great job of it. There's also a bit of history, by the way, while Commodus is speaking to Lucilla, and I think he's got Lucius on his knee. He mentions Claudius, and if I remember correctly, Claudius's sisters did betray him in a conspiracy, and of course Commodus mentions this and says, that the emperor was so very hurt by the betrayal of his sister. And the thing is, if you know anything about the Roman emperors, particularly Tiberius comes to mind, Claudius comes to mind, Nero comes to mind. They're a bunch of nutjob psychopaths. Some of those Roman emperors are like textbook cases of why you don't have an autocracy, of why you don't have one man at the top making all of the decisions. It's a terrible idea, because if that guy turns out to be a crazy person, then there isn't too much that you can do. And I was also thinking while I was watching this scene, by the way, and Commodus mentioning Claudius, that Commodus really has nothing on Claudius. Like, he has absolutely nothing on Claudius or Tiberius or Nero. It's interesting, like, what a great villain Joaquin Phoenix plays in this movie. But if you really learn about those Roman emperors, they're just awful. The things that they did and the things that they managed to quite often get away with are just really, really, really bad. And so the plot against Commodus, unravels. It comes apart. The Praetorians show up at the Gladiator training grounds where Maximus is with Juba and the German guy and his other mates and Proximo, and the Praetorians are demanding that they open the gates, and the gladiators are, of course, in this case, they're like, Maximus, we are with you, and we'll do whatever you say. And so they decide to fight. Maximus, of course, goes underground and tries to find a way out back. For the first time you see him now, he's got his original armor and sword and all the rest of it, and he escapes out the back. But of course, he's caught. Cicero is killed, and at this point in the movie, you're just like, oh shit! Like, everything's gone to shit. The plot's been discovered, and now, that's it. What's going to happen? Maximus is now surrounded by a bunch of men. Some have arrows pointed at him, others have spears and swords and whatever. Like, he's done. He's done now. The plot's been discovered. And one thing about the scene where Proximo is killed actually is that Oliver Reed at this point had died. He was quite old at that point, and I think he'd had a lifetime of problems with alcohol too. And so, again, I can't believe they did this in 2000. They got a body double, and then they CGI'd Oliver Reed's face onto that body double. And I don't know if it was just because it was DVD rather than 4K or what, but even then I was trying to look for signs that they'd done this, that this was CGI, and I couldn't tell. It looked really, really good. And Proximo has a great final line, shadows and dust. So we are shadows and dust. We're all going to die anyway. This is this is the way that it is. A lot of the gladiators, at least, seem to be killed that night, and I think the last thing that Maximus says to Proximo is, Proximo, are you in danger of becoming a good man? And again, sort of the redemption arc of Proximo. Maximus is such a heroic, principled, virtuous man that he's even converted the cynic Proximo. And so we have this final kind of face-to-face meeting between Maximus and Commodus. Though before that, we have a short meeting between Quintus and Maximus. And Quintus basically says, I'm following orders. I'm a soldier. That's what I do. And Maximus isn't particularly, impressed by that. You have this figure of Maximus who has up to this point sort of done the right thing, and Quintus saying, well, I'm just following orders. And that's quite interesting. And I'll come back to that. But then, of course, you've got the meeting with Commodus and Maximus. So Maximus is, and there's some symbolism here. I don't think this is coincidental. This came up. My mate was actually kind of the first one to mention the first bit of this anyway. Commodus had mentioned earlier in the movie that he wanted to have a child with his sister Lucilla and have a pure blood dynasty that would last 1,000 years. It reminded me, of course, the Third Reich. Of course, they wanted a Reich that lasted 1,000 years, and they were talking about pure blood. And I thought, is that a coincidence? I don't think that's a coincidence. And then you have the moment between Commodus and Maximus now, where Maximus's arms are kind of held up like that. He's shackled, but his arms are by his sides. I thought, well, that's a little bit Jesus. Is it that Commodus is like a Nazi basically, and that Maximus is essentially Christ? Because of course what happens next is Commodus stabs him in the side, and of course what happened to Christ, if you're talking about Christ figures in storytelling, well, he's speared in the side. And so of course now we have the final showdown between Maximus and Commodus. This is the moment we've been waiting for in the Colosseum. It's just them two. Of course, they're surrounded by a bunch of Praetorians, but nobody's meant to get involved. And of course, you can see that Maximus is a little bit sluggish. He's a bit slow. He's not fighting anywhere near as well as he was earlier on in the movie. And there's a point where he's just about sort of holding on. Maximus sort of gets off a slice of actually thinking about, is it the upper part of Commodus's arm, which is where Maximus was injured, close to the beginning of the movie. I think Commodus ends up losing his sword, and of course, eventually Maximus ends up getting a hold of Commodus's knife, which he had hidden in his gauntlet, and ends up killing Commodus. And this is kind of the redemption arc now for Quintus, with seeing what a fantastic man that Maximus is, that he's able to convert people kind of to his cause, like Proximo, like Juba, like Quintus in this case. Because when Commodus is asking for a sword, give me a sword, because he lost his sword in the middle of the fight with Maximus, Quintus tells the Praetorians to sheathe their swords. They're supposed to leave them in there so that Maximus can win fair and square, given that he can, he's defeating Commodus even though he's been stabbed in the side. And just about as, pretty much as soon as Commodus is killed, Maximus immediately starts sort of, having visions of his farm. And it reminded me of the line towards the beginning of the movie, which is, if you find yourself alone riding in the green fields with the sun on your face, do not be troubled, for you are in Elysium, you are already dead. When they're showing sort of the afterlife, essentially, or what Maximus is seeing, is, it's sunny and there's some green, so great bit of foreshadowing towards the beginning of the movie. So the final scene, of course, is with Juba, and he's burying the little models of Maximus's children and his wife, and Hans Zimmer's playing "Now We Are Free," if I remember correctly. That scene, by the way, that was meant to be Proximo doing that. And though in a way I think it does kind of fit more that it's Juba that's doing it instead, because of course, you know, Oliver Reed by this point was not able to do it because he had passed away. We get to the end of this movie, and I mentioned this when I saw the movie again. The first Gladiator movie is wrapped up pretty well. Does it need a sequel? I don't think it needed a sequel. And when I first heard that there was going to be a sequel, I thought, oh God, this is more likely to go down quite badly. They might very well end up sort of ruining the legacy of this film, which has held up, you know, 24 years later, very well regarded. It's considered a classic now. I don't know that they've done the correct thing in making this sequel. We'll see. I'm booked to see the sequel at the IMAX on the 15th when it opens here in the UK. We're getting it a week before the US. So I hope that you guys liked my rundown of Gladiator, guys. If you liked this, please like, subscribe, all the rest of it. Leave a comment, and, you know, it helps me grow my channel. And I hope that you guys will be around for my other video, which I'll be making on Gladiator II, which is coming out very shortly. Have a good day. You take care of yourselves.